I've been talking about inflation for 10, 20 years. I mean, it's been a problem. We've been in denial of the inflation problem. One of the reasons we've been able to deny it is because we don't measure it accurately. So all the years that the government kept telling us inflation is 2% or lower, it was actually quite a bit higher than that, but we weren't measuring it properly. But it went off the charts in the aftermath of COVID. And I'm not a Monday morning quarterback. I remember March of 2020 when the Fed announced this QE infinity program with COVID and we dropped rates. And I was saying that this was the worst possible combination of monetary and fiscal policy I'd ever seen, the most inflationary combination of policy, that the correct monetary policy would have been to shrink the money supply because everybody was staying at home and not working. So economic activity was contracting, production was contracting. We needed to contract the money supply along with the goods supply. If we didn't do that, prices were going to rise. But we did the worst possible thing. Instead of contracting the money supply along with the economy, we expanded it even faster. We basically told people to stay at home and don't work, don't produce anything, but here's a bunch of money to go out and buy stuff. Buy what? They weren't making anything. And in fact, we gave a lot of people more money not to work than what they earned when they did work. And of course, when they worked, they were at least productive. When they sat at home, they produced nothing. They were getting paid more to produce nothing than they earned producing something. So I said this was a disaster, that prices were going to skyrocket, and that's exactly what's happened. And we're not nearly done with it. We still have a long way to go on the upside when it comes to prices. And I think what we're experiencing now is just a bit of a trough. And so the lull before the next storm. This is what's transitory, this decline in inflation, disinflation, which is how Powell described it. This is transitory. I think before the end of the year, we're going to start to be surprised once again, the way the Fed was in 2021, by how strong inflation comes roaring back. Not that it ever went away, but the improvement's going to go away, and we're going to start to see even worse data than what we saw last year. When you talk about it, you don't even want to talk about the damage and blame it on inflation and say inflation is causing all this harm among working class people. It's not inflation, it's the government that's doing it, because it's the government that's creating the inflation. So it's the government that is harming working class people. And how are they doing that? By paying for government spending through inflation rather than through legitimate taxation. Because all these programs that guys like President Biden like so much cost a lot of money. And nobody wants to raise taxes to pay for the programs. Now, of course, they'd love to raise taxes on the rich. That's easy. But the rich are already paying a lot of tax. And, they're not going to pay much more. So to the extent that you really want all this government, you've got to make the middle class and the working poor pay for it. But they can't afford it. They can barely afford to support themselves. So what the politicians do is they say, well, we're just going to print money. We're just going to run deficits. And that's how we're going to pay for these programs. And that causes prices to go up. And so when people are struggling to pay the rising cost of food or shelter or insurance or everything else, that is the tax. Those higher prices is how they're paying for all these government programs. And so if the cost of paying for those programs is imposing hardship on the public, it's the government's fault. And if the government cared about the people, they would cut spending to relieve the public of the burden of paying for all those programs.
Yeah, well, in an ideal world, but the average person doesn't really even understand where inflation comes from. They think inflation is strictly higher prices.
Yeah, and that's not an accident. That is by design. Everybody wants the public to misunderstand inflation. In fact, inflation is probably the most misunderstood term in the English language. It doesn't mean rising prices. It means an expansion of the money supply. Rising prices is just a potential consequence of inflation, but it is not inflation. And so once you redefine inflation as rising prices, well, then you can blame it at Putin. You can say, well, Putin's the reason that prices are going up. Or you can blame it on greedy businesses that are profiteering. But when you properly define inflation, then you can't do that. It's obvious who's causing inflation if it's an expansion of the money supply. because it's the government that expands the money supply. It's not corporations. Putin can't expand our money supply. Only we can do that. You know, President was all upset last night because hotels want to charge resort fees. Oh, that's not fair. You know, that's bad marketing. I mean, compare that to what the government does. Look, if you don't like resort fees, just don't stay in hotels that charge them. I mean, it's ridiculous. The problem is if you don't like your taxes, you got to pay them. You don't have any choice. Instead of worrying about the $25 resort fee, you know, why don't they worry about the thousands of dollars that families are paying in the income tax and the inflation tax? Do something about that.
I mean, most of this money is wasted. Efficient government is the biggest oxymoron around.
Well, government can never be efficient because nobody is efficient with somebody else's money. That's impossible. You're going to be extravagant.
So looking at what's happening with AI, all right, do you have any insights, anything you see personally in the financial industry? Is it really a cause for concern, or we just worrying about nothing here?
Well, look, I don't think innovation, progress is ever a cause for concern. Now, can individuals be concerned about how it may impact them in the short run? Sure. I mean, you can look at artificial intelligence. I mean, maybe in the financial services industry, you can say, well, you know, we could replace financial advisors, you know, with just computers. And, you know, for the type of advice that you get from most financial advisors, you're not going to notice the difference because it's all robotic anyway. But, you know, the computers only know what they've been programmed to know. And, you know, so I don't feel threatened that somebody's going to replace me with AI, but maybe I'll be able to replace some of my employees with artificial intelligence. But that will just make my business more efficient, and I'll be able to pass that on to other people, my customers, and, you know, with a lower fees. It goes back to the beginning of, you know, of machines. You know, people were always afraid, oh, you're going to put people out of work, right? Somebody invented a bulldozer, and, oh, you're going to put out of work a lot of people who were digging with shovels. Well, that's true, but shovels put out a lot of people who were digging by hand. You know, the shovel was a big improvement. Should they have never had the shovel because it destroyed jobs? You didn't need as many people to dig? No, and then they shouldn't destroy the bulldozers and all these other earth-moving equipment that made labor more productive. So all of this artificial intelligence is going to make humans more productive. I think the absolute goal of humanity will be a society where machines do everything, and we don't have to do anything if we don't want to. Right, where you just live a life of leisure, or you pursue things that are gratifying, mentally stimulating, physically stimulating, you know, things that you want to do. But all the mundane tasks could be done by computers, by machines. They're not going to get bored. They don't care how many times they have to repeat a task.
No coffee breaks.
It's like they don't matter, right? And of course, you know, they're not going to sue you. You know, you can't sexually harass them or discriminate against them.
You could try.
Right? I mean, they're gonna do what needs to be done, and they're not gonna complain.